The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. When Oscar Wilde published The Picture of Dorian Gray in 1890, he wasn't just writing a novel. He was dropping an atomic bomb on the morality of rigid Victorian society. We all know the story. A remarkably handsome young man, Dorian, wishes that a portrait of him would age in his place, allowing him to remain eternally young and immaculate. But behind this classic, aesthetically driven deal with the devil lies one of the darkest and most fascinating reflections on human nature, art, and guilt. Today, we're analyzing how this literary masterpiece has been adapted for the screen, and why translating Wilde's prose into cinema is an almost impossible task. To truly grasp the darkness of Dorian Gray, we first have to understand the man who created him. Oscar Wilde wasn't just a brilliant writer, he was a full-blown 19th century celebrity, an eccentric dandy. Born in Dublin in 1854, Wilde made the motto "art for art's sake" his religion, becoming the undisputed leader of the English aesthetic movement. His life was as much a work of art as his books, but it was also marked by a tragic downfall that eerily mirrored the fate of his own character. Wilde loved to provoke the hypocritical Victorian elite with his razor-sharp aphorisms, but that same society would never forgive him for his freedom. In 1895, at the very peak of his success, the writer was engulfed in scandal due to his relationship with a young lord, Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie. Bosie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, publicly accused Wilde of homosexuality. Proud and defiant, Wilde sued him for criminal libel, but the trial backfired disastrously. In a courtroom that felt more like an inquisitorial theater, passages from Dorian Gray were used by the prosecution as evidence of his immorality. Sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency, Wilde was locked away in the brutal Reading jail. He emerged broken in both body and spirit, dying in poverty and exile in Paris in 1900, at just 46 years old. In the end, Dorian Gray is a mirror of its own author, the story of a man who defies the morality of his time only to be destroyed by the weight of his own secrets. It is precisely through this biographical lens that we must reread the book. The Picture of Dorian Gray is the quintessential manifesto of decadence. For Wilde, art has no educational or moral purpose. Art exists simply to be beautiful. Yet, the novel's tragic paradox is that while Dorian pursues pure aesthetic beauty and unbridled hedonistic pleasure under the influence of the cynical Lord Henry Wotton, a character who embodies Wilde's own provocative wit, his soul is rotting away in the attic. Wilde's absolute genius lies in what is left unsaid. The novel never explicitly details Dorian's sins, vices, or alleged perversions. Wilde evokes an abstract moral corruption, intentionally leaving blank spaces for the readers to fill with their own fears, desires, and taboos. And this is exactly where cinema meets its biggest obstacle. How do you visually display the invisible without making it cheap or mundane? Let's take a step back in time. The first truly monumental cinematic adaptation arrived in 1945, directed by Albert Lewin. This adaptation deeply respects the spirit of the original text. It preserves the elegance of the dialogue, and just like in the book, Dorian's vices remain largely implied, hidden behind the scenes due to the strict censorship of Hollywood's Hays Code at the time. However, to satisfy the commercial and moral expectations of the era, the film amplifies the final punishment, turning Wilde's philosophical parable into a more conventional horror-style warning. Now let's fast forward to 2009, with the version starring Ben Barnes and Colin Firth. Here, cinema does the exact opposite of what it did in 1945. In the 21st century, censorship taboos are gone, so director Oliver Parker decides to show everything. Dorian's perversions are explicitly thrown onto the screen. Sex, drugs, graphic violence, and digital special effects used to show a painting that doesn't just rot, but actually bleeds and moves like a monster from a horror movie. The problem with this approach? By spelling everything out, you lose Wilde's subtle psychological unease. The haunting fascination of the monster hidden in the attic is replaced by a somewhat superficial Gothic thriller. Colin Firth is extraordinary as Lord Henry, perfectly capturing that signature Wildean cynicism. But the film ultimately prioritizes action and visual shock value over the protagonist's profound existential and philosophical crisis. The real discrepancy between the book and almost every film adaptation lies in Dorian's physical appearance. In the novel, Dorian is an almost angelic, blonde boy with delicate features, whose utter visual purity contrasts chillingly with his internal monstrosity. Cinema, however, has almost always preferred actors with more mature, dark, or visibly tormented features, like Ben Barnes, missing the tragic irony of an innocent beauty masking an absolute void. Furthermore, the painting in the book isn't just a horror prop. It is a mirror of the viewer's conscience. Every wrinkle of hypocrisy, every line of cruelty takes shape on the canvas. When cinema goes overboard with CGI, it turns the portrait into a Frankenstein's monster, whereas Wilde wanted it to be something far more intimate and terrifying, the naked, raw truth that we can never hide from ourselves. The picture of Dorian Gray remains an immortal masterpiece because it speaks to all of us. It taps into our obsession with appearance, our fear of aging, and the price we are willing to pay to maintain a flawless facade to the world while we rot on the inside. But above all, it holds the wounded soul of its creator. Cinema has tried to capture it in many ways, giving us aesthetic marvels and entertaining thrillers. But perhaps the best version of Dorian Gray will always be the one printed on the pages and tied to the tragic genius of Oscar Wilde. Which adaptation do you prefer? Are you for the classic charm of 1945 or the modern 2009 version? Let's talk about it down in the comments. See you in the next video.